Okay, well, welcome back to Return to Yehovah. Today, I would like to talk about something that I've been thinking about for a long time. It's the calendar of Yehovah. Okay, so I'm calling this something like keeping Yehovah's calendar. There's a lot of confusion out there of how we're supposed to do it. There's it seems like every time God is revealing something to us or to His people, the enemy comes along with counterfeits, okay? I'm here to talk about the thing that is not the counterfeit. You have to make that decision. I can't convince you because who am I? I'm just another guy, okay? But part of the reason I want to talk about this is as I look on the biblical calendar that I have, and I've been getting every year from a certain organization, and I'll tell you about that either at the end of this or for sure in the description below. But here, as you can see, it is the 12th biblical month. I don't know, hopefully I'm not covering that up too bad. So that means out of 12 months, we're in the last month of the year, maybe, okay, and we'll find out. But see, today, being March 4th, the small print is the date that we look at on our Gregorian or Julian, whatever they call this calendar that we keep in America and most of the world, okay? But you'll notice it's got a big number 26, and this is not crucial for today to know. It's just I'm showing you we are actually on the 26th day of this 12th month. So there's 4 days expected, okay, left. And then at the end of the month, this will be the end of the 12th month. Just remember that as I go into things later, and then you'll kind of know why we're talking about it. It's mainly because the timing is coming up where we're going to see a month change over from one to the next. Quite possibly we're going to be going into a new year on God's calendar. And then that leads us into God's feast days, okay? So now some of you guys have heard this kind of stuff because there's a lot of Messianic and Bible teachers that have put out tons of videos about the feasts. And to be honest with you, ever since I started putting up videos, I've resisted doing anything about the calendar because I just thought there's so many things about the feasts and everything, so I just didn't want to, okay? There's a couple places I'll recommend later that they have lots of good information, and you can really dig in and research, and I think even ask them questions, and you should get all your questions answered. I don't pretend to be the expert by any means, but I have learned from these other groups and from digging into things and searching it out in the Bible to make sure what they say is really in there for at least about 5 or 6 years, maybe more, okay? So just to kind of begin here, as far as Yehovah's calendar, for centuries there has been a Jewish calendar for keeping Jewish feasts. Okay, we've all heard of some of the different ones and everything, and we have a calendar in the Western world or whatever, but the Jewish people have a calendar that they keep, and anyhow. It's interesting to me that now that God is opening the eyes of many of His people to turn back to His Torah and His commandments and everything in the Bible, that a lot of them are wanting to follow God's calendar. In fact, I've been in congregations that talk about God's calendar, being on God's schedule or whatever. But they are going by a calendar that was created by rabbis centuries ago for good reasons. Excuse me, I don't want to go into the details of all that or the history. All I can say is it served its purpose at the time, but I do know it was shocking to me when I learned that many rabbis have been saying, and I guess even the sages, they say, the older rabbis from the past, have said that when Messiah comes, then the people of God will get back to keeping the calendar according to the Bible, according to the Torah. And I was like, why aren't we doing that now? And actually, I'm not the first one to ask that question. So there are people that have been doing this long before I ever came across it. So there's people with years of experience doing this kind of thing, and I'll get into what that is. And so I've just learned from them, okay? This isn't just something I discovered on my own. I don't claim to, be the originator of any of this, okay? But first of all, it turns out the Bible describes a much different calendar than the one that the rabbis have pre-calculated. All right, so let's take a look at what God has to say about that. Now, a chapter in the Bible that covers not all, but a lot about the feasts. I mean, it gives you a lot of good groundwork for it, is Leviticus chapter 23, okay? And I'll say verses 1 and 2, it says right here, "And the Lord," or Yehovah, "spoke to Moses, saying, Speak to the children of Israel, and say to them, the feasts of the Lord," or the feasts of Yehovah, "which you shall proclaim to be holy convocations," or set apart meetings, you could say. And he says, "These are my feasts." So God himself is saying that they are his feasts. Okay? A lot of people call them the Feast of the Jews or whatever, In fact, even the book of John in your King James Bible will refer to things that are one of these feast days we'll talk about, and they'll say a feast of the Jews was approaching. And this is a rabbit trail, but I'll try to keep it short. The Apostle John, he lived his entire life, except for maybe the very end, I don't know, but you know that. But I mean, he lived his entire life in the land of Israel. He was probably fluent in Hebrew, maybe spoke Aramaic, that doesn't matter, but he would not have written a feast of the Jews. I mean, he would have said our feast of whatever, So what we're reading there is a translation of whatever he might have, he himself might have written years before. But that's just one of my little pet peeves about the book of John. Otherwise, I love the thing, but there's little snippets like that drive me crazy, Okay, so anyhow, these are God's feasts, nobody else's. He says they're my feasts, okay? And what's interesting or important we should note, if they're his feasts and, he gets to decide when they fall and what they're about and all that kind of stuff. And I should say the word feast, and a lot of people know this, I'm not, I hate repeating things that have been taught for many years now, but the word feast in Hebrew is moed, just M-O-E-D is how we would write it. But plural would be moedim with an I-M, it's just that word, but it means an appointed time, or plural, appointed times, okay? So in other words, these are times that God has set that he wants to meet with his people, and he says, at a certain month, on a certain day, at a certain time, generally is how he lays out some of these, and you'll see that as we go. And so it's like if God himself, the creator of everything, and the God you claim to serve, if he says, these are my feasts, this is an appointment I have with you, write it down, I want you to meet me at this time, on this date, blah, blah, blah. Who of us would want to just, approximate when we're going to meet him? If he says, I want to meet you on a Friday night at sundown over here, are you going to show up on a Wednesday afternoon or maybe the next day on a Saturday and say, isn't that close enough? The calendar I have says that was close enough. Okay? Obviously I'm being, ridiculous about it, but no, we want to learn what God says his days are, and believe it or not, we have the tools available nowadays to be able to be on track with what he says. Just a lot of us don't know these things because no one's, shared them, and that's partly why it's been bugging me, and I want to put it out there, okay? All right, so first of all, let's see, I've written a lot of this down, so I want, off my head, and I want to be able to keep on track, so bear with me. So I guess I'll just kind of reiterate something I say a lot, but I can't stress enough that since God is revealing this information to his people, he wants us to come back to his commandments, back to his Torah, and back to his calendar. Okay, so, we need we need to understand this is something God is doing. This isn't anything I've decided I want to push on people, or there's no denomination out there that's, come up with this and it's the new trendy thing. Okay, this is not like that. This is God moving among his people and just doing it. Okay, I mean, to me it's incredible to look back after the last 5, 6, 10 years and see the things God has revealed, not just to me, but to tons of people all over the world. Okay, so there's a move of God going on in this world, and a lot of people are just totally oblivious. Okay, but hopefully if you're tuned in, you're not one of those. If you are, you can still catch up. Okay, so don't worry. All right, so we're talking about God's calendar. I'm going to try to keep this pretty basic. If this is all new to you, don't worry if some of it seems to go by you. Some of these concepts, when I heard the first few times, I thought the people were crazy. They were telling like, I don't need to know that. And if you feel that way now, maybe look at this 6 months down the road again, or stop and go through it again and see if it starts to make a little more sense. But by all means, you can look at some of the scripture references, and at the end of this, assuming this gets up on YouTube or whatever, you can ask me questions. I mean, I don't have answers for everything, but I'll sure, be able to tell you whatever I know, okay? Anyhow, let's start. Since to have a calendar, I wanted to start at the smallest piece. We got to know how a day works in God's plan of things or whatever. If you didn't know, God looks at a day differently than man has been for the last several hundred years. It begins at sundown. Now, I know that sounds like, wait a minute, we start at sunrise, don't we? Or at midnight. Like in our world, in America and stuff, when the clock ticks midnight, the next minute after that, or second for that matter, is the next day. Okay, technically. I know everybody, looks at it a little bit different, but like New Year's Eve, midnight on that day is the next day, okay? A lot of people think of the day begins in the, morning when the sun comes up, all right? And ends when the sun goes down, but that's not what God says. He says, basically that on any given day, when the sun goes down, that is the end of that day, but the beginning of the next day. It's kind of weird, but it takes, it took me a minute to get this, but it makes perfect sense once you've, gotten used to it. I'm going to quote a couple of verses out of Genesis 1, so right out of the beginning of the Bible. Genesis 1:5 says, "And God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. And the evening and the morning were the first day." So it gives evening first and then the morning. Now obviously we know, that's not enough to make one whole day, but just work with me here. And God called, this is Genesis 1:8. God called the firmament heaven. Again, I skipped a couple verses in there. And he says, "And the evening and the morning were the second day." Now, this is where traditionally, and I mean, as far as I know, from the beginning, God's people have been keeping track of the days that way. And this is seen with the Sabbath day, for example. Any Sabbath day begins on a Friday afternoon or evening as the sun goes down. So at sundown, it begins the Sabbath, and then you have all day Saturday, and then Saturday evening at sundown is the end of the Sabbath, okay? So it's not just the daytime of Saturday when the lights are on or when the sky is blue. It's from Friday night till Saturday night. Pretty straightforward. So that is a day, okay? Now, each month gets a little trickier, but it's interesting. Each month begins by the sighting of the new moon. In fact, the Hebrew word that is translated as month, which is what we're talking about, is Kodesh or Chodesh. It's a little hard to make that out on the camera here, but and it comes from a root Kadash, which can mean renewed. So you could say that the new moon up in the sky is the renewed moon each month. Now that'll make sense if you think about the phases of the moon, because really the beginning of a month, you first see, like as you're looking at me, if my head was the moon, let's say it would be all dark except for this thin sliver on this side would be, the new moon. Not when it's all dark, because you can't see an all dark moon, okay? But God made it something we could see. We could look in the sky and see. So anyhow, that first sliver that would be on this side as you're looking at me, and then as the days go on, this sliver gets a little bit wider, than it's half. Then eventually you'll have a full moon, and then it'll start shrinking down, and before you know it, you'd have a crescent at the very end of the month on this side, right? And waxing and waning and that kind of thing. And so anyhow, that's the phases of the moon, and God, made it that way, and He wants us to look at that first sliver as the new moon. So, despite the other theories that men have come up with, because if you look up in an encyclopedia or a dictionary, you may be told that the new moon is the time where the moon is dark, and it's like, no, and the fact that it's just, it's one of those arguments I beat my head against the wall, because people are taking what 20th century man says as opposed to what the Bible and the people of the Bible have done for centuries, and they know what they're looking for, okay? But it's that first sliver of the from dark to the first sliver that appears of the new moon. But it's important that you understand this, when a month ends, like this month we're talking about, the 12th month, at some point, I don't know exactly what day, but at some point the moon will go completely dark at the end of this month, okay? And I didn't know this until I'd been digging into this more, but it could be anywhere from 2 to 3 days that the moon would be not visible because it's dark. So you really can't predict when it's going to be seen in the sky, okay? And as I've come to learn, the people that have kept track of these things for decades, really, they have figured out that a month is always ever either 29 or 30 days. There's none of this 28 days or 31 days, okay? But just so they know, it's either going to be 29 or for sure 30 if if it doesn't end on a 29th day. Some of this hopefully will make sense as we go. All right, so it's a dark moon for 2 or 3 days, and what's cool is you won't know exactly, will it be 2 days, maybe 3 days that this first sliver thing would appear, So you can't say for sure, you can't pre-calculate exactly when it's going to show up. Therefore, you have to wait and see before someone can declare a new moon. So I think it's cool that God determines that. And it could be that on the 29th day of a month, let's say, that people are out there looking for the new moon and it's cloudy, storm clouds or whatever, or there's too much light from the sun, depending on the time of year, that they just can't see the new moon sliver. And, sometimes it's tricky to see it, but if they can't see it, they have to say, well, we didn't see it, okay? You can't lie about it. And one thing I haven't said is really the thing about this, it's not like me, some guy just out in the Pacific Northwest, outside of Seattle, Washington. I can go out every month and look for the new moon, and I could say, I saw the new moon and all that, but that doesn't affect God's calendar one iota. It matters in the land of Israel and honestly in Jerusalem or that surrounding area. If you get at least 2 witnesses that will look up and say, we saw the new moon. And nowadays, since the way we do things with internet and stuff, now I haven't been there to do it, but I've gotten the reports for many years of people that are over in Israel that will keep track, and they'll say on this date and time, about, and I think they even record about how high up in the sky the moon was or whatever, and a lot of times they'll take a photograph of it, and then they report them into this certain place, and somebody then passes a report on through Facebook or whatever, so other of us around the world can know that the new moon was sighted, and I think I actually get I have 3 different sites that will send out an email or a message about the new moon. They're all connected, but so if I miss the one, I get it from the other. And You might think, well, this is kind of weird. What does that have to do with anything? Because God determines the beginning of a month by when that first sliver of the new moon, just when you hear new moon, think of the first sliver that's visible in the sky over Israel. Okay? Anyhow, I know I'm maybe going on a little bit longer, but you might ask, why does it have to be in Jerusalem? Well, keep in mind that's eventually where, God's people were and the temple stood. And in the days of the temple, the priests depended on witnesses to be looking for that moon to tell them when the new month started. Because when a month starts, it might be the month that begins one of the feast times, and you have to know, am I in the first month or the fourth month or or whatever, you know what I mean? And you'll see as we talk about the feasts, some of them depend, at least 2 of the feast days depend specifically, either way, it's important to know when that moon is seen so that the month can begin and you know where you are on God's calendar. Let me put it that way. Okay. Now, let's see. Like I said, there's people that put this information out. So even if you don't live in Israel, it's entirely possible nowadays with our technology to find out about this stuff. One other thing I will tell you, when I've gone out, because I told you I live in the Pacific Northwest, and I will go out, every month. Especially, I'll figure out, usually from an email or something, I get a general idea when you should be able to see the new moon. So I'll go out there and look, and if I see it, sometimes it's tricky because I live where it rains a lot and there's a lot of clouds, but if I see it, then I will take my shofar. I've got one, it's over there, but I don't want to get off camera, and I will just, blow on it for a little bit, and of course my wife thinks I'm crazy, and my son kind of rolls his eyes, but I don't care. I'm doing it because it's in Scripture. In Psalm 81 verse 3, it says, "Blow up the trumpet in the new moon in the time appointed on our solemn feast day. For this was a statute for Israel and a law of the God of Jacob." Okay? And the word trumpet that's translated, I think this was New King James Version, the word trumpet in Hebrew is shofar. And you've all seen those we call it a ram's horn, but it's really like an antelope horn, those longer ones. And yeah, it's really cool. It's just, but imagine, you could go out every at the end of every month, whether with your kids or friends or like if you're part of a fellowship group. And I used to do this with a home group I was part of for a couple years. And we'd go out and, some people would get up on their rooftop even, and we'd look for the new moon, and when we'd see it, we'd blow the shofars and everything. So it's pretty fun. And this is all just doing Bible stuff, doing God's real, actual stuff from God's Word that we can do nowadays that people did back in the days of Elijah or the days of Solomon or whatever, or David, So, it kind of makes it all come alive. All right, so we talked about days, and we talked about month, kind of how they're figured. The next thing is the year, how God determines the beginning of a year or whatever. And you need to understand, this is crucial, because the year begins in the springtime, and it's in the time of the Passover and the Exodus from Egypt. Okay, that's crucial, and there's several verses that talk about that, and I'll get to that in a minute. But if you've heard of the Jewish calendar and what the rabbis have calculated and all that, when they came back from Babylon, or probably while they were in Babylon, they came up with this calendar to be able to somehow keep track of the feast days and all that. But they adopted some Babylonian ways. I've heard from scholars that documented this, but to where somehow they changed it so the beginning of their year starts in the fall, and they call it Rosh Hashanah or Rosh Hashanah, which is like the head of the year or something like that. And it's like, that's not what God said, and you'll see in just a minute. But the year begins in the springtime. So listen what God says in Exodus 12 verse 1. It says, "Now Yehovah spoke to Moses and Aaron while they were still in the land of Egypt, saying, 'This month shall be your beginning of months. It shall be the first month of the year for you. And he told them to speak to all the congregation of Israel and say to them, on the 10th day of this first month that we're in right now, or we aren't, but he was talking about that he's in, at that time, on the 10th day of this month, every man shall take for him a lamb according to the house of his father, a lamb for a household. And if you're familiar with the Passover or the plagues in Egypt and all that, that was the preliminary thing they had to do before they had to kill the Passover lamb and all that. And then Exodus 12:6 goes on to say, now you shall keep this lamb until the 14th day of the same month. So that's important. Getting the lamb and then keeping it until the 14th day. Then the whole assembly of the congregation of Israel shall kill it at twilight. And that's literally the Passover, okay? And then he tells them to take some of the blood from it and put it on the doorposts and the doorposts and on the lintel of the houses where you eat it. We've all seen that, pictures of that or whatever. So that connects the beginning of the year, according to God, with the Passover and the Exodus from Egypt, and with, it's the beginning of the months. In the springtime is what I was trying to say, okay? So that time of year, not in the fall. So forget that. I'm sorry that a lot of people follow that rabbinic calendar. You might as well just take it and throw it out because it is off base, okay? And I'm not beating up the Jews or the Jewish people. They did with the calendar what they needed to do at the time, and it was, it served a purpose at the time, but God's ready to get back to the old ways, and that's, to me, the cool thing, All right, now there's another piece of the puzzle that is crucial to know about, and this is going to sound a little strange to a lot of you, because when I first heard it, I was like, what? It just didn't make any sense. And I'm not going to be able to answer everything about it, but just go with me here, okay, and hear what it is. So there's a word called Aviv, A-V-I-V, or sometimes some groups of people spell it A-B-I-B, Abib. All right, and you'll see that in some translations in the Bible. But this word relates to the barley harvest in Israel. I don't think anybody talks about it outside of the land of Israel, but if they do, it really isn't important because we're concerned with what's going on in Israel, so it can be God's calendar. All right. So let me give you a couple. There's like about 4 verses. Let me just read them to you real quick. Every one of them talks about the month of Aviv. And I don't know if you can understand what I'm saying. I wish I could say it a little bit clearer, but A-V-I-V. But if you hear the verse I give you, maybe you could write those down or just make a note of it. First one is, and this is one of my favorites, but Deuteronomy 16, verse 1. God tells them, observe the month of Aviv and keep the Passover to Yehovah your God. For in the month of Aviv, Yehovah your God brought you out of Egypt by night. So God himself there is talking about that month that he calls Aviv, and he's connecting it to the Passover and when God brought the children of Israel out of Egypt, okay? So that's why Deuteronomy 16:1 is a good one. Now, Exodus 13, 13:3, okay? Moses said to the people, remember this day in which you went out of Egypt, out of the house of bondage, for by strength of hand Yehovah brought you out of this place. No leavened bread shall be eaten. On this day you are going out in the month Aviv. Okay, he's talking about the unleavened bread they're supposed to eat, but that's related to one of the feasts, and we'll talk about that later. Okay, but anyhow, so in the month of Aviv, again, these are all feasts that happen in the very beginning of the spring. Exodus 23:15. This one says, you shall keep the feast of unleavened bread, and then he says in parentheses, you shall eat unleavened bread 7 days, as I commanded you at the time appointed in the month of Aviv, he says, for in it you came out of Egypt. none shall appear before me empty. So he's telling them how important it is. And the main thing is, though, I want to focus on this is that same time, Passover, Feast of Unleavened Bread, they are, right next to each other, and it's in the month of Aviv. There's a reason I keep emphasizing it, because it's crucial to knowing how we begin the year, okay? Lastly, the verse I want to show you is Exodus 34:18. It says, "The feast of unleavened bread you shall keep. 7 days you shall eat unleavened bread, as I commanded you, in the appointed time of the month of Aviv. For in the month of Aviv you came out from Egypt." Okay? So, just trying to make that abundantly clear. That word, that means something, and it's crucial to know, okay? And part of the reason, I won't go into detail now, it all relates to a time when the barley crops in Israel, not anywhere else, gets to a stage of ripeness, being a certain stage. It doesn't mean you can, harvest it yet, but for whatever reason, it's a term they used back in the day. Moses and them were familiar with it. We just, unless you're a farmer of barley, you're probably not even going to have any idea what they're talking about, and I didn't, but it's understood to be a certain stage of ripeness of the barley crop, okay? And so again, it's prior to it being ready for harvest, but it's heading that direction, okay? For whatever reason, when it happens, that's like a sign from God. Okay, this is going on. It is coming up to the month of Aviv, okay? And it's not just a name of a month. It's a time in the crop schedule, if you want to say, that God has said is important, okay? So the cool thing is how people that have been doing this for decades and that keep track, of all this in God's calendar, according to the Bible, in Israel, they look at two things. Yes, they look, well, I'll say first, they look for, like right now, here, like I've told you, we are in the 12th biblical month, okay? Here we are, March 4th. It is the 12th month on the calendar, and this is the year 2019. People differ on what year it is on the on God's reasoning or reckoning. Honestly, my mind is not made up on what that is. Some will say it's 57 something or whatever. Some say it's 6018 or whatever. I don't know, so I'm not going to make a decision on that. But I just want you to know, in the current month we're in, this is the 12th month. That's why I'm making this video now, is because I want you to be hopefully able to start catching up a little bit if you didn't already know this stuff. So just know that sometime this week, if they haven't already, people in Israel are looking for the barley crops. They go to certain fields that are growing barley, and the people that know what they're looking for can tell, oh yeah, it's Aviv or it's not, okay? And if the people that I'll say are the experts over there, if they say it's absolutely Aviv and they have a way to prove it and they can, take pictures or whatever, and once they determine that, then the next step, part two, it's like a two-pronged thing to determine the year has begun. If the barley is of that stage of Aviv, then the very next new moon that is seen after the barley is getting ready, or at that stage, the very next new moon begins the first month of the next year. Okay, so that'll be called officially the month of Aviv, and that will mean that from there you have to count out a certain number of days till Passover and the Feast of Unleavened Bread and all that. Those are on specific days, like God said Passover is on the 14th day of the first month. Okay? And then the Feast of Unleavened Bread, which he says he wants us to keep and to do, starts on the 15th day, the very next day. And it goes for 7 days. And so on from that. The rest of the feasts, there's spring feasts and fall feasts, are all calculated off of getting that month right. Okay? So if we don't have faithful witnesses to tell us the barley's at the right stage, and somebody sees the new moon after it, if the barley guys are lying, then we're off base. We may have the wrong month, okay? But let's say we've got our trusted experts. They look at the barley fields and they're like, it's not ready yet. It's not there. It is not Aviv. So, unless it happens the last day of the month and they're like, wait, we found it, I don't think it's that crucial, or I shouldn't say it's not crucial. I just don't think it happens down to the second of the month or anything like that. But they're looking, this week or whatever. If they don't think it's at the right stage, then for the calendar, you add a 13th month. Now that may sound a little funky to what we're used to. We're used to January through December, but we're not talking about that. We're talking about God's calendar. You add a 13th month, and then by the time that month comes to the end, as far as I know, without fail, I don't think it's ever failed that since I've been paying attention, but they will have found the barley to be ripe enough. So imagine God controls the weather and the crops and all that stuff, and he, his system makes it so that this year we need to wait a little bit later in the year for the barley to be ripe enough or whatever, okay? He controls those things. Man does not. All right, so anyhow, if we have to add an extra month, a 13th month, then at the end of that, there's never a 14th month. For whatever reason, it doesn't keep going like that. I don't know. I've never known of a case where you'd ever have anything more than a 13th month, because I guess, the barley's always been there or whatever since I've known about it. So anyhow, the very next new moon that is seen after or at the end of this 13th month, then that begins the month of Aviv. It's called the first month of the year. And then from there, you count your days to figure out when Passover is going to be, so you can keep it on the right day. Okay, you have to know when it is, so you're keeping God's feast days, His appointed times, an appointment with God on the right day. Okay, I realize that's a lot of information to kind of throw out there in a video like this, but hopefully you'll kind of get the general idea. To me, this is so cool because, like I say, over the years, as I gradually learned all this stuff, I didn't have somebody give me a video with boom, 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 all this stuff, and have to try to take it in. I was able to get it in stages, okay? So if you need to do that, that's fine, But there really is a system and a network of people that are keeping God's calendar alive, or helping to reinvigorate God's calendar back to His people. And there's Jewish people and there's Christian people. I don't know if there's any that are secular. They may be. I don't know why they would want to, but they may want to follow God's stuff. I don't know. But anyhow, to me, it's very cool. So we've covered, how the day is from sundown to sundown. How the month is when you see that first sliver of the new moon, and then your year has to be first the barley being at a certain stage of ripeness, and then if you get to that ripeness, then the next new moon that begins the next month is month number 1, and from there you count the number of days to have your the feast of Yehovah. Okay. Now, like I said, you can look at these feasts. A lot of it is detailed in Leviticus 23. Okay, you can read about them in general. Some of it, well, of course, I look at the King James, but you don't have to. The New King James is a little bit more helpful, but I'm not going to go in any kind of depth at all on these, but I want to just list them off because I think it's important that you know, and I'm going to give you an interesting little tidbit as we get to the fall part. I made up just a sheet. Now, it's not something I don't have a website, so I don't have any way to make it available to you, but I just listed them out as I know them and as they are in Scripture. But God gave us these feasts, these appointed times or whatever, and there's 4 of them in the spring and really 4 of them in the fall. When I first learned, I was told there were 7, 4 in the spring and 3 in the fall, and then over time it's like, well, wait a minute, there's really an 8th one, but we'll get to that. So just real quick, let's say we know we are in the first month of the new year, okay? Day 1 of month 1 is number 1, okay? And then you count, because Passover is the 14th day of that first month. So just count down and, whatever it ends up being. I mean, if it's an April something or middle of March or whatever, it is on your calendar so you know what day you're on, because most of us aren't running around with our watch telling us it's, Aviv 4 or something like that, right? So anyhow, you've got Passover is the 14th day of this first month. The Feast of Unleavened Bread is for 7 days in a row, starting with the 15th day. And so he tells you about that. So you can count on that, whatever is the 15th day, and then there's 7 days in a row that you are to eat unleavened bread, like matzah or tortilla type things or whatever, I don't want to go into too much detail because some of these get a little tricky, and there's schools of thought that will confuse people, and I really don't want to go into the detail of them now, but maybe another video I'll put out in better detail. After the unleavened bread, you have the Feast of First Fruits, okay? And that really is a picture of, when you would collect the first fruits of barley harvest and present them to the Lord or whatever, okay? And there's talk in the Torah about how that was done by the priests and all that. But just to give you a real quick overview, Yeshua died on Passover, okay? He was in the grave for 3 days and 3 nights. He really was, and I'll talk about that another time, but it was not on Good Friday, by the way, all right? But anyhow, he was in the grave during the time of unleavened bread. But during that time, when he rose from the grave, it was the end of the Sabbath, the weekly Sabbath, and he would have rose from the grave, I believe, right after the first tick of the clock, going into the end of the Sabbath, the beginning of the first day of the week. People call that Easter, and sorry, I don't like that word, or Sunday or whatever, but that would have actually been the day of first fruits. And we talked about, or it says in the Word how Yeshua led captivity captive, or it's a picture of him when he goes up to heaven, to present his body, after, rising from the grave. Remember, the people couldn't touch him yet until he went and ascended to heaven. And a lot of people think that the hints in Scripture are that he took some of the saints of old with him and presented them and his body. I don't know for sure, but it's a cool picture. He presented them before God the Father in the heavenly temple, and that kind of thing. So that's the Feast of First Fruits. And then later, you have the Feast of Weeks, which is known as Shavuot or Pentecost. We've all heard about Pentecost, Acts chapter 2, the Holy Spirit fell on the disciples and all that. Okay, all that is considered the spring feasts. And when those things occur, all takes its start from when you've got the correct month that you're counting in. Okay, so you've got to be in the month of Aviv, and it's, so the barley had to be correct, and it had to be the new moon sighted, so you're in the right month and first day of that month, and then you count to all these different things, all right? So without that calculation or that reckoning, you'd be way off on the feast, and you won't meet God when he wants you to, okay? Now we get to the fall feasts. I'm just going to try to cover it well. I'll tell you this. Every one of them, there's the Feast of Trumpets, which I'll talk about in a minute, otherwise known as Day of Blowing or a Day of Shouting. There's Yom Kippur, you probably all heard of, the Day of Atonement. There's the Feast of Tabernacles or Feast of Sukkot, and that's a 7-day long feast. And the last one, number 8, is called the 8th day. It's literally the day after the 7 days of tabernacle, okay, or tabernacles, okay? But now, just like the spring feast had to depend on the sighting of the moon and all that kind of stuff, when you get to the fall feast time, you have to know exactly when you'll know if you got the first month right, You'll be in the second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth. When you are in the sixth month, at the end of that, the moon is going to go dark for 2 or 3 days. You won't know how long. And someday, after the sixth month is ending, someone will be able to see the first sliver of the new moon that will begin the 7th month. Okay, now the cool thing about the Feast of Trumpets is it is on the first day of the 7th month. So if you're paying attention at all or tracking with me, you need to get that day right. Okay, so if you are seeing, like, imagine this is the 6th month of a year, and if it's beginning to get dark and we go outside to look for the new moon, if we see the new moon in the sky, or be going this way, but whatever, if you see the new moon in the sky and people, at least 2 of you see it or whatever and all that, and you blow your shofar, but that actually, at that moment, that the sun's going down and you see the new moon, that is considered the first day of the 7th month, and it is called the day of blowing of trumpets, or the Feast of Trumpets. Okay, and I won't go into it now, but a lot of people, me included, think that was a day when Yeshua was actually born. Okay, there's some cool teachings on that, and I'll talk about that probably at a later date. But see if this phrase rings a bell with you at all. Since we have to wait and watch for the new moon, okay, we can maybe get close within a couple of days, but we don't know, and nobody knows the day or the hour when they're going to finally be able to see that new moon. Now, if you do it enough months in a row, year after year, you'll have a general idea what time of day you can go out, especially if you keep track. But in general, no one knows the day or the hour when that first sliver is going to appear of the new moon, and then we declare the Feast of Trumpets. And see, the reason that matters is not only because it's an important feast, the first day of the 7th month, but the Day of Atonement is the 10th day. So until you know when the first day is, you can't calculate the 10th day, okay? And then after the 10th day, you have the Feast of Tabernacles, starts on the 15th day of that month for 7 days in a row. And then when those 7 days are done, so after day number 22, then the next day after that is called it's called the 8th day, but it's considered a solemn assembly, and it's not one you hear a lot about, but if I ever get into more detail about these, I'll try to cover a little bit more. And there's a lot of places that have teachings about that out there, but so all I'm trying to do here today, it is kind of an overview. I realize it's a lot of information. I'm not really sure how long this video has gone, but I will cut it here. I'm going to put down at the bottom of my in the description below 3 different places. One place is called Devorah's Date Tree. I'll put it down there and a link for it. You can get new moon and Aviv barley reports from Israel. The next one is citedmoon.com, and that's got a lot of great teaching. It covers about the barley and the new moon and all that kind of stuff. And the third one is a rudeawakening.tv, and again, I'll put that down there, and there's a lot of good stuff on there. And you can actually get a biblical calendar. That's where I buy my calendars, is from that, but I'm not doing commercials. Okay, this was kind of long. I appreciate it if you hung in there with me. If you had to, cut it in half and come back later, that's fine. But for now, I'm going to end it here. But thanks for tuning in. Yehovah bless you and keep you.